You are a newborn human being, and biologically, you are a disaster. You can't lift your own head. You can't regulate your own body temperature. You can't even cling to your mother's fur. She doesn't have any. Your skull is so large relative to her hips that the birth itself nearly killed you both. Somewhere on an open plain, in the dark, something is calling. Welcome to the wild 200,000 years ago. Right now, you can Google a fever in 4 seconds. Back then, no fridge, no formula, no one on call. So how did a species born this helpless actually survive infancy, with no cribs, no clinics, and no baby monitors at all? In 2000, anthropologist Paula Ivy published a study in the journal Current Anthropology after living among the Ife people of the Ituri forest, in what's now the Democratic Republic of Congo. She counted every person who touched an Ife newborn. The number, an average of 14 different caretakers per infant, most of them close kin. By 3 weeks old, an FA baby was already spending 40% of its time in arms that weren't its mother's. By 18 weeks, it was spending more time with those other caretakers than with her. Primatologist Sarah Hurdy later coined a term for this pattern, the cooperative breeder, and argued it's the only reason human mothers could have babies faster and closer together than any great ape before them. One mother in the wilderness, alone with her baby. That's the picture most people carry around. The data says otherwise. Everyone assumes a mother in the wild raised her baby completely alone, defending it single-handedly day and night, with no one else in sight. The data says the opposite. Among the Aka foragers of Central Africa, anthropologist Barry Hewlett found that infants stay within arm's reach of their fathers for more than half of every day, a level of paternal contact higher than almost anywhere in the industrialized world. If you're raising a newborn right now with a partner who's back at the office by week 2, that number probably sounds like fiction. So if mothers weren't doing this alone, how did the actual physical act of birth even happen? In 1987, biological anthropologist Wenda Trevathan published Human Birth: An Evolutionary Perspective, and it reframed how scientists think about the earliest hours of a human life. She pointed to something called the obstetric dilemma. Walking upright narrowed the human pelvis. A growing brain widened the human skull. Those two trends collided. A chimpanzee gives birth facing her baby and simply reaches down to lift it out. A human infant is typically born facing away from its mother, rotated in a way that makes unassisted delivery mechanically difficult. Trevathan's conclusion was blunt. Actively assisted birth is almost unheard of in other primates. In humans, it's close to universal. Picture a woman in the wild giving birth completely by herself, gritting her teeth in a cave with nobody around. It's a common image. It's also, according to the anatomy itself, nearly the opposite of what usually happened. Human bodies are so poorly matched for solo delivery that some anthropologists argue something like midwifery may be nearly as old as childbirth itself. Here's where it gets strange. Once the baby actually arrived, the real work had barely started, and it began with something most modern parents would find unrecognizable. In 1980, Melvin Connor and Carol Worthman published a paper in the journal Science, based on fieldwork with the Kungsan people of the Kalahari Desert in Botswana. Using direct timed observation, they measured how often Kung mothers nursed. The average gap between nursing bouts, 13 minutes. Not 13 times a day, 13 minutes apart, for a couple of minutes at a time, repeating around the clock, with the infant carried skin to skin in a sling the entire time. There was no bottle. There was no schedule pinned to a wall. The infant signaled, and within minutes it was fed. You'd expect that much constant contact to make a baby clingy, spoiled, unable to cope on its own. Researchers studying crying patterns in these same populations found something closer to the reverse. Infants who were held constantly and fed the moment they fussed tended to cry less, not more, than infants left to wait. If your idea of good parenting involves a strict feeding window and an app that logs every ounce, this probably sounds like a different species entirely. But feeding and holding a baby is only half the labor. Someone still has to feed everyone else. In 1998, anthropologist Kristen Hawkes and her colleagues published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences after studying the Hadza people of Tanzania. They tracked who dug up the toughest, most calorie-dense food in camp. Fibrous underground tubers, young children physically couldn't extract themselves. It wasn't the mothers, who were often busy with a nursing infant. It was the grandmothers. Postmenopausal Hadza women turned out to be some of the most productive foragers in the entire camp, and their labor tracked closely with how soon a daughter could safely wean one child and start the next. Grandmothers sound like a modern bonus, something families get to enjoy now, that people simply live longer. Hawkes flipped that logic entirely. Her argument is that women may live decades past their fertile years precisely because a grandmother who kept foraging could keep more grandchildren alive. Menopause itself might be one of the strangest side effects of raising human babies. If your own grandmother lives 3 states away and video calls on birthdays, you already know how differently the story ends now. In 2021, a research team led by archaeologist Jamie Hodgkins published findings in the journal Scientific Reports about a burial at Arma Verana, a cave in Liguria in northwestern Italy. Inside was an infant girl, somewhere between 40 and 50 days old when she died, roughly 10,000 years ago. She hadn't been left behind or set aside. She'd been dressed in more than 60 carefully pierced shell beads and 4 pendants, with an eagle-owl talon placed nearby as an apparent offering. Researchers estimate producing that many finished beads took 8 to 11 hours of skilled work, hours a grieving community spent decorating a baby who never spoke a word, or gathered a single meal. So if there's one real answer underneath all of this, it isn't fire or tools or any single invention, it's redundancy. A human infant was never survivable as one person's job. It needed an Ife-style rotation of 14 different sets of hands, and a father within reach half of every day. It needed a species willing to physically assist at the one moment every other mammal manages alone. It needed milk on demand, not on a schedule, and a grandmother who kept working long after her own fertility had ended. It even needed strangers, 10,000 years later, still willing to spend 8 hours making beads for someone who would never say thank you. The helplessness came first. The community was simply the adaptation built to cover for it. Go back to that newborn on the open plain, skull too big for the hips it's passing through. Born into a world with no cribs, no clinics, no baby monitors, nothing between it and the dark but skin. Alone, it had no real chance at all. Passed between 14 sets of hands, fed on demand by a mother who was never expected to manage it solo. Dug for by a grandmother who'd stopped having children of her own, so she could keep other people's children alive. It had a very good one. Today, a lot of new parents do this exact job in an apartment, with a phone full of parenting apps and nobody down the hall. We solved the biology a long time ago. We're still working out how to solve the loneliness. The species that couldn't survive infancy alone somehow ended up asking its parents to do exactly that. A newborn human can't lift its own head, can't regulate its own body temperature, and is born with a skull barely small enough to survive its own delivery. 200,000 years ago, there were no cribs, no clinics, and no formula waiting in the next room. So how did a species born this fragile actually make it to adulthood? And what does that story say about how we raise babies now?